Sorry about that interruption. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? It's great to be with you. That was Hallelujah, based on Psalm 150, sung by Hillel Tigay, the Chazan of the Ikar congregation here in Los Angeles. And I actually directed a music video for Hillel and the congregation a few years ago. Nina will put that link in the comments. We had a fantastic time making it. It was just a beautiful, beautiful song based on a beautiful, beautiful song. And we had so many people come out and really give of their heart and soul. And you should check out that video. And you'll see why I wanted to share a singing rendition of Psalm 150, often called Hallelujah. But it's something that specifically the Levites would sing in the ancient temple in Jerusalem when the first fruits were brought. And we're going to be talking more about that a little later. Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us as we do a little learning on a fine Wednesday evening? Melissa in Great Neck, Stephen in Dover, Pauline in Arkansas, Harold in Oregon, James in Indy, Judy in Grants Pass, Oregon. Welcome, Judy. Lucy in Minnesota. Bill says, Shalom, nothing better after a stressful day than unwinding with AT Daily. It's funny you said those words because I said something almost exactly the same earlier today to a few of my friends. These are such stressful times. You should listen to this. And it was, totally not a religious song per se, but it was Willie Nelson and Ray Charles singing Seven Spanish Angels. Amazing. If you ever just need to unwind, you can listen to Hillel's song Hallelujah. And you can listen to Willie Nelson and Ray Charles sing Seven Spanish Angels. Rochelle Rosen says, good evening. Stephanie in Philadelphia. Samantha in Tacoma. Renee says, Indy in the house. Ann in Merced. Paula in Oregon. Chaim in Charlotte. Nancy in North Carolina. Michael Diamond in Scranton. Welcome, Michael. Fred in Miami Beach. Loretta and Harold in Oregon. Peter Engel says, hi, Sal. Nice to see you, Peter. Sammy in Dallas. Alejandro says, Hodesh Tov. It is the new month. Yes, it is. What month is it? It's Shvat. Begins tonight. It's Rosh Hodesh. Tomorrow we add Hallel to our morning prayers. Alejandro Martinez from the Dominican Republic. Bienvenido, Alejandro. Renee says Hodesh Tov. Nina shares the link to the music video. Robert says Shalom Haverim. Hello, my friends. And Robert is tuning in from Malaysia. Welcome, Robert. We are truly international tonight. Carlos Ariano says blessings. Janice is with us from Dallas. Sharon in Lebanon. Bill agrees with me. I love Seven Spanish Angels. That song from Willie and Ray Charles. And Denise in Jackson, Alabama. Carolyn in Raleigh. And I always skip the first part of your name because I don't want to pronounce it wrong, but I'll try. Mahalakshmi Megdom in Pennsylvania. Welcome, everybody. Over there on the YouTube side, let's see, that's Neil in Virginia, Gigi in Vancouver, Lindsay in Cincinnati. And Nina shared the link over there on the YouTube side as well to our music video of Hallelujah by Hillel and the Ikar congregation. Tonight's class is dedicated by Marjorie Holler, who I know always tunes in from Georgia. And Marjorie is dedicating our learning in memory of William Byrd of New York City and for comfort for his wife Alicia and their young daughter Sibylla. May William's memory always be for a blessing. May his neshama, his soul, have a great aliyah, a great elevation in the world of souls. We say amen. And Marjorie, may you and all your loved ones be showered in blessings for supporting our learning. And we say amen. All right. Where are we holding? Let me get organized here. Pardon me. This is page 53, Nun Gimel. here in Tractate Pesachim, the 4th volume of the Talmud. We're in chapter 4. We're going to complete our discussion of the first Mishna of chapter 4 and open our discussion, and actually complete it, of the second Mishnah in chapter 4. Recall that what we've been talking about in this first Mishnah is the idea that the sages decreed that we cannot work on the morning. No Jews can do work in the afternoon before Passover begins. Passover begins on the night of the 15th. The 14th is the day before, but that means the afternoon and the morning of that night belong to the previous day on the Hebrew calendar. That would be the 14th of Nisan. No Jews can do work in the afternoon. In some communities, they also prohibit work in the morning. In other communities, they allow work in the morning. This led to a discussion of minhagim, customs, right? The custom of a community, whether that's a geographic community or sometimes a community organized along other principles. But whatever community you're in, if it's got minhagim with respect to Jewish law, at times, very often, those minhagim are going to become binding. So even though it's more of a prohibition than even the rabbis required, right? There's Torah law. The rabbis made a fence around Torah law to protect us from coming to violate Torah laws. Those were their rabbinic decrees. And sometimes communities will, just as a form of custom, go even a little bit further, even a little bit more stringent. And if you're in such a place, as we've learned, generally speaking, the law is that you should take on yourself the stringencies both of the place where you're from and the one where you're visiting. And so you should take that more stringent attitude, meaning less likely to fall into a transgression, even if you're not bound in your own community by those additional stringencies. If you're a guest in such a community, then you should respect them and not sort of conduct yourself according to your own customs, but now you're in their place, and that might lead to a dispute and what they would consider disrespect of their customs, or even worse, that it might cause a dispute in their community when they see you behaving in what seems to them a prohibited manner. Maybe they'll now start arguing about it and say, well, we had it wrong. If that's allowed, maybe something else is allowed, and there could be a general lowering of respect for the law. That's a general principle we've been talking about, and specifically lately we've been talking about in a sabbatical year. So there's a law that you can eat produce that you have in your storehouse. In the sabbatical year, the farm fields are not planted. So if you have fruits or produce, the kind that normally would be growing in the fields, in the farm fields, planted, now they're not planted. Okay, so you can eat what's in your storehouse as long as those kinds of fruit, those kinds of produce are still occurring naturally, either in the fields where it wasn't planted but it grew anyway, or in the wild, as it were. If those fruits can be found out in the wild, then you can eat what's in your storehouse. But when it can no longer be found in the wild, where the undomesticated animals could eat it, then you can no longer eat it in your storehouse. But of course, it sort of gets used up. The animals eat what's available in the wild at different times in different places. So if you come from a place where it's still available in the field, but you get to a place where it's no longer available in the field and you have some with you, even though at home you could have kept it for yourself and eaten it, now you have to remove it from your possession, sort of go outside, give it away to anybody who's going to come and take it and eat it. You can no longer own it, or certainly not do commerce with it. You can't do commerce with it in a sabbatical year anyway. So that's where we are. And now that we're on this subject of, you can't keep it in your storehouse when it's still available in the fields, the sages are going to tell us a few principles about how late certain kinds of fruit and produce are available in the fields and in the wild in the land of Israel. So we pick it up near the top of page 53a here in Tractate Pesachim. The sages taught The sages taught one may eat grapes during the sabbatical year until the grapes on the vine branches in the place called Ochel have ceased. And if there are grapes elsewhere later than those, one may continue eating grapes on their basis, as the sage's statement is merely based on the assumption that the grapes in Ochel are the last to remain in the field, but the halacha, the law, is not specific to them, right? So the sages are telling you that generally speaking, the last place in Israel where you're going to find grapes still growing out in the fields is this place, Ochel. And so, as long as there's grapes in Ochel, you can count on that and keep them in storage at your house. But if you happen to find grapes growing later in your locality, okay, so then you can keep them a little bit longer where you are. Similarly, one may eat olives until the final olives have ceased on the trees of Tekoa. Rabbi Eliezer says one may eat olives until the final olives have ceased on the trees of Gush Chalav. At what point is the fruit considered to have ceased? At the point that a poor person will go out to search for fruit and find neither in the tree's branches nor in the proximity of its trunk a quarter kav of olives that have fallen. So even if you find some olives there, that like one olive growing on the tree is not enough. There has to be like a little minimum amount. It's enough that the poor people who go out and gather get a quarter kav. I'm not sure offhand like what a quarter kav is. What would that look like? I don't know, maybe a small bucket type of thing. And at what point is the fruit considered to have ceased? I'm sorry, I just said that. And one may eat dried figs until the unripe figs of Beit Hini have ceased. We learned in the Mishna, one may eat dates in all of Judea, right, throughout all of the Judean area of Israel, until the last palm tree in Tzoar has ceased producing dates, right? So Tzoar is the place where you can count on dates being available at the latest time in the year, on the date palms. And Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, so one may continue eating dates based on those between the palm branches, even if they've fallen, they're between the branches. But one may not continue eating on the basis of those which have fallen among the thorn branches, because they're not available to the animals in the field. They're not going to go in and eat those. Those are basically just going to stay there and rot, and you can't count that. You can't look at those and say, well, the fruit's still available in the field, so I can keep it in my storehouse. And the Gemara raises a contradiction from that which was taught in a different baraisa. One may eat from the grapes until Passover, from the olives until the festival of assembly, meaning Shavuos, from the dried figs until Hanukkah, and from the dates until Purim. And Rav Bevai said, Rabbi Yochanan transposes the last two. So that would mean from the dried figs until Purim, and from the dates until Hanukkah. According to his version of the baraisa, one may eat dried figs until Purim and dates until Hanukkah. This is inconsistent with the previous statement that dates may be eaten until those in Tzoar have ceased. So is it that there's a region where the dates can be expected to be on the trees the longest in all of Israel? Or are we tied to, these calendar dates that basically these holidays are basically going to mark when those fruits can be eaten until? And the Gemara resolves this contradiction. Both this time and that time are one period. It's the same. The first sage designated the deadline in terms of the place where dates grow, and Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel designated the deadline in terms of the dates. And if you wish, the dates, meaning the dates on the calendar. And if you wish, say instead that it is taught explicitly. And if there are fruits elsewhere than those, one may continue eating on their basis. This indicates that the places and times mentioned are merely indicators, but that the prohibition depends on actual conditions in the field. The Gemara continues. It was taught in a baraisa that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, a good sign for mountains is the gallnut oaks. Now, the gallnut oak is one that its nut is used actually to produce ink, black ink that is used by scribes, which is used in the preparation of ink. And a good sign for valleys is palm trees. A good sign for streams is reeds. A good sign for the plain is a sycamore tree. And although there is no proof for these indicators, there is an allusion to the matter in the verse as it is stated, and the king made silver to be in Jerusalem like stones, and he made cedars to be as the sycamore trees in the plain. That's first book of Kings 10:27. Now, what does this mean? A good sign for the mountains or the plains or the valleys. What does it mean? A good sign. Very often we'll see this kind of thing in the Gemara, that it will introduce an idea out of nowhere, and we have no idea what it is that is being offered to us, and then it will explain. And the Gemara elaborates on this Tosefta. So a good sign for mountains is gallnut oaks, and a good sign for valleys is palm trees. What purpose is served by these signs? The practical difference of these signs pertains to the halacha, the law of the first fruits. As we have learned in a Mishna, one may bring first fruits, bikkurim. So this is an offering that was brought to Jerusalem, to the Holy Temple, when the temple was standing in ancient Israel. And they were the first fruits that came onto, the in the farms and in the orchards. Right, so and we're going to read about. I'm going to tell you about how they were actually brought. But the basic idea is that the first fruits that emerged in the orchards and fields, the farmer would mark them, and then he would harvest them, and he would put them aside, and he wouldn't eat them or sell them or even tie them. He set them aside specifically to be bikkurim, to be the first fruits that would then be brought in a very special, colorful, beautiful and inspiring ceremony that I'm going to tell you about in Jerusalem at the temple. And were these first fruits brought from all the fruits that are grown in Israel? No, they were brought from the 7 species. What are the 7 species? These are the particular, there's 5 fruits and 2 grains that are mentioned in the Torah and which characterize the fertility, the fecundity, the beauty of the land of Israel. And what are they? That's wheat and barley. Hold on, I want to make sure I get it right. Wheat and barley, grapes, figs, pomegranates, olives, and dates. So for those 7 species, the first fruits of the species would be set aside and then brought to Jerusalem. And as we learned in the Mishnah, one may bring first fruits only from the 7 species and only from the highest quality fruit. Therefore, one may not bring first fruits from palm trees that grow in the mountains, since the mountains are not a suitable location for palm trees. The dates grown there are inferior. Similarly, one does not bring first fruits from fruits that grow on the palm trees in the valleys because Similarly, does not bring first fruits from fruits that grow on palm trees in the valleys because mountain fruits do not grow there properly, right? So what they were telling us is that these are good signs for bringing fruits from those regions. And then there's going to be some disagreement on that, at least in terms of these other good signs, because it says a good sign for streams is reeds. What does that have to do with the first fruits? And that's actually going to be assigned to a teaching about a different law, which is when there's a murder and a body is found in the field between 2 towns, and no one knows, who the killer is or where this person came from. And then the elders will come from the 2 nearest towns and they'll say, we don't know what happened to this person, but we recognize that it is a tragedy. And there's a special ceremony that Torah specifies for that situation, where an animal, a cow, is slaughtered as an offering, as an atonement, right, for the people who were not able to care for this victim who ended up murdered. And where is that atonement? Who needs to bring it? The elders of the nearest village. They need to actually measure for that purpose. Even if they're sure which village is nearest, they actually have to do the measurement. We've seen that before. And then where is the cow slaughtered? It actually says the calf's neck is broken in a rough stream. What is a rough stream? What is the appropriate stream to do this ceremony? One which has reeds growing out of it. So now that we've mentioned the bikkurim, the ceremony of the first fruits, I thought it would be nice to learn a little bit about the first fruits and how they were brought to Jerusalem when the temple was standing, and really the commerce and agriculture of Israel was built around Jerusalem, and the offerings brought in Jerusalem. So I credit Rabbi Menachem Posner of Chabad. He has a wonderful article on Chabad.org, and I was really just going to, take a few facts from the article. But as I was looking at it and thinking, well, okay, I want to read that, I want to read that, I want to read that. Like every word that he says really brings that whole scene to life and teaches about the law. So I'm just going to read this article by Menachem Posner to you. And it's great. And now you'll also see how wonderful it is, and I'm sure it's not a coincidence, that now that we're in Tractate Pesachim, the laws of Passover, why are we talking about bikkurim? Okay, it came up as a digression on a digression with respect to customs and whether we work on the morning before Passover or not. But as we'll see, the words from the Torah which one recites when he brings the first fruits to Jerusalem are going to, as part of that recital, is going to sound very familiar to anybody who's ever been to a Passover Seder, because a very famous line from that recital is in our Haggadahs. Let's go. Okay, so the bikkurim, the first fruits, were brought by farmers in ancient Israel to be placed near the altar in the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. Near the altar, not on it. So the text that we're going to read is familiar to anyone who has attended a Seder, namely, an Aramaean nearly caused my father to perish, and he went down into Egypt and sojourned there with a few persons, and there became a nation great, mighty, and numerous. That's actually in the Passover Haggadah, the Maxwell House version. Okay, so where is this text from, and what is it doing in the Haggadah? These words are lifted from the verses that Jewish farmers would say every year when they brought bikkurim, the first fruits, to the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. Here is the entire narrative in its original context from the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy. It will be, when you come into the land which the Lord your God gives you for an inheritance, and you possess it and settle in it, that you shall take of the first of all the fruit of the ground, which you will bring from your land, which the Lord your God is giving you. You shall put them into a basket and go to the place where the Lord your God will choose to have his name dwell there. You shall come to the Cohen, the priest, who will be serving in those days, and you shall say to him, quote, I declare this day to the Lord your God that I have come to the land which the Lord swore to our forefathers to give us. The Cohen will take the basket from your hand, laying it before the altar of the Lord your God. And then you shall call out and say before the Lord your God, an Aramaean sought to destroy my forefather. And he went down to Egypt, and he sojourned there with a small number of people. And there he became a great, mighty, and numerous nation. The Egyptians treated us cruelly and afflicted us, and they imposed hard labor upon us. So we cried out to the Lord, God of our fathers, and the Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression. The Lord brought us out from Egypt with a strong hand and with an outstretched arm, with great awe and with signs and wonders, and he brought us to this place, and he gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. So now, behold, I have brought the first of the fruit of the ground, which you, O Lord, have given to me. Then you shall lay it before the Lord, the Lord your God, and prostrate yourself before the Lord your God, and then you shall rejoice, and rejoice in all the good that the Lord your God has granted you and your household, you, the Levite, and the stranger who is among you. So that's the text that one recites when he gets to the temple in Jerusalem, gives these fruits to the Cohen, to the priest, and the priest arranges them around the altar. Lots of fruits were coming down. So you can imagine when you think about Thanksgiving and a cornucopia, I mean, the altar and the surrounding area was just piled and piled and piled, and beautiful fruits being brought from around the kingdom of Israel. And that the actual bringing of the fruits from the towns and fields up to Jerusalem, it's so beautiful and colorful. Listen to this. So the commandment of bikkurim began when a farmer in Israel and some of the surrounding areas would go out to his field and find budding fruit, and he would tie a reed around them, verbally declaring them first fruits. These are the first fruits. Now, this applied only to the fruits of the 7 species of the land of Israel: wheat, barley, grapes, figs, pomegranates, olives, and dates. And that's basically the order in which they ripen. And the first fruits were brought to the temple between the holidays of Shavuos and Sukkot, but there was an extension given in case you were late, and you could bring it as late as Hanukkah. The Torah does not specify how much fruit needed to be brought, but the rabbis decreed that it should be at least 1/60th of the crop. So it's pretty significant. The fruit was packed in containers. Wealthy people would use trays of gold and silver, and simple folk would use baskets of grass and reeds. Were the rich people, just being highfalutin and showy? Were they showing off by using the expensive vessels? No, everybody was doing the best of their ability to beautify the mitzvah, right? They're beautifying the bringing of these fruits. So that's why they would just give do it a little bit nicer if they could. They would also carry turtle doves and pigeons in their hands. Similarly, they would hang turtle doves and pigeons from the sides of the baskets in order to adorn the first fruits. Those that were with the baskets would be offered as burnt offerings, and those they would bring by hand would be given to the priests. How were the first fruits brought to Jerusalem? Villagers of each region would gather in a central town where they would sleep in the city's thoroughfare. They did not enter the town's homes lest they contract impurity by being under the same roof as a corpse. The bikkurim needed to remain tahor because they were going to be an offering in the temple. They needed to stay in a state of ritual purity. And so the people were going to be meticulous as they were involved in the journey of bringing the fruits up to Jerusalem, that they might, that they wouldn't mistakenly end up in a situation where they were, for example, under the same roof as a corpse. If somebody happened to die in a house and they were inside that house, they would become tamei, and then they would not be qualified to bring that fruit up to the temple and enter the temple with it. Where am I? In the morning, right? So first they would gather in the towns. The people from the fields, the local farms would gather in a town, and then once there was a critical mass of people in the town, they would all go up together. In the morning, the leader would call out, "Arise, and let us ascend to Zion, to God our Lord." An ox with horns coated in gold would lead the procession, a crown of olive branches on its head, representing the 7 species from which the first fruits were taken. A flute was played before the procession until it reached Jerusalem. And the entire way the people proclaimed, "I rejoiced when it was told me, let us go to the house of God." They would travel for only 2/3 of the day, allowing others along the way to notice them and join in the procession. So it's like maybe a group of farmers, 10, 20, 30, start in a town. Then they start going up the road to Jerusalem. They go slowly. They're singing. They're dancing. They've got all these, wonderful baskets of fruit in their wagons pulled by an ox with gold around its horns, olive branches around its head. And as they got near Jerusalem, more and more people would join this procession, this parade of joy and of the first fruits. When they were close to Jerusalem, emissaries were sent to notify the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And they adorned their first fruits and beautified them. And if they had some produce that was fresh and other produce that was dried, well, then the fresh produce was placed on top. The leaders of the Israelites and of the priests and the temple treasurers would go out from Jerusalem to greet them. When the procession had entered the gates of Jerusalem, the people began declaring, "Our feet were standing in your gates, O Jerusalem." That's from Psalm 122. And all of the artisans in Jerusalem would stand and greet them. Our brethren, the inhabitants of such and such a town, you have come in peace. They proceeded through Jerusalem, the sound of the flute accompanying them, until they reached the Temple Mount. There, even more important personages, right, VIPs, such as the King of Israel, placed baskets on their shoulders and proceeded until the temple courtyard, all the while singing Psalm 150, right? Psalm 150 that I played at the top of the show tonight as sung by Hillel Tigay and the congregation of Ikar. And at that point, the Levite choir would sing, I will exalt you, God, for you have raised me up. That is from Psalm 30. And there, with the basket still on his shoulder, the farmer would make the first declaration, I declare this day to the Lord your God, the whole recital that we talked about that one says when he brings the bikkurim. He then held the edges of the basket, and the priest held it from below and waved it up and down in 4 directions, reciting the formula, an Aramean sought to destroy my forefather. So next time you're at a Passover Seder, you'll hear those words, an Aramean sought to destroy my forefather. And you're thinking, well, it's just about the story of the Jews going into Egypt and then coming out of Egypt. But this was the recital at a magnificent ceremony, the bringing of the first fruits. And now you've got that very colorful picture in your mind of all these farmers in procession bringing these fruits to Jerusalem. He then placed the first fruits near the southwest corner of the altar, bowed reverently, and departed so that the next farmer could come along. The first fruits were given to the priests who were on duty at that time. Remember that every week there would be a new shift of priests who would come and all of the priests in the temple were replaced every week. There were 24 shifts of priests. And so they would basically serve, 2 or 3 times a year. And they divided the produce amongst themselves to be eaten within the walls of the holy city of Jerusalem. The priest took the fruit and returned the expensive containers to the owners. In the case of a reed or a grass basket, both the first fruits and the basket were given to the priest. So think about that. The rich people who could make the very beautiful show of beautifying the mitzvah, bringing the fruit in silver and even gold baskets, gold trays, they were given back their trays. But the more humble people who brought the fruits, in these reed baskets, they would give the whole gift to the priest and the entire gift was accepted. Right? This is a case where you'd probably prefer that the whole thing be accepted, and so that was only for the humble. After sleeping in Jerusalem overnight, the farmer was free to return home. Now, Rabbi Posner adds, well, this only applied when the temple was standing, right? So now we study this procedure and the laws that are given for it in the Torah, and as the rabbis discuss them. And there's a whole tractate in the Talmud called Bikkurim. We'll be revisiting all of this when we study Masechet Bikkurim. However, in the absence of the temple, when this mitzvah no longer applies, there are actually numerous ways in which we carry on the spirit of this commandment, the spirit of this mitzvah. The text of Bikkurim was selected to become a fundamental part of the Passover Haggadah, as we've discussed, and the Seder plate is seen as a symbolic representation of the Bikkurim basket. The Seder plate is seen as a symbolic representation of the bikkurim basket in which the first fruits were brought to the temple. Thus, the entire Seder experience becomes an annual reenactment of the bikkurim ceremony. Why was this text chosen? It is a wonderfully succinct telling of our exodus from Egypt and our expression of gratitude to God. Just the right text to be expounded on during the Passover Seder. Gratitude. 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 There is no more fundamental spiritual practice than gratitude. And I'll mention at this point that starting Sunday evening, I'm taking the kids for a little dad and kids time in the mountains. Nina's going to stay here. There won't be AT Daily next week from Sunday to at least Thursday. I'm probably going to come back on Friday, start teaching again on Friday. But while I'm away, Nina's going to teach a class at least on Sunday and Monday. And she's going to be drawing from the teachings of Rabbi Victor Miller. And a big theme of what Nina's going to talk about in terms of practical spiritual tools for better living is gratitude. So you definitely don't want to miss that. Where am I? In addition, a primary theme of bikkurim is that of gratitude, of thankfulness, and appreciating the good that we are given. In Hebrew, this is known as hakarat hatov, recognizing the good. The bikkurim ceremony teaches us how important it is to verbally acknowledge God, our principal benefactor, as well as his many agents. The sages say that one who brings a gift to a Torah sage is considered to have brought bikkurim. And indeed, it was the custom of Hasidim, of the pious, to bring such bikkurim, such gift first, not exactly the first fruits of Israel, but when you bring a gift to your Rebbe, it's called bikkurim, and they would bring bikkurim gifts to their Rebbes, particularly around the holiday of Shavuos, when the bikkurim would start to be brought. So even though we have no temple, God assured us through the prophets that when we study about the temple and its sacrifices, God considers it as if we had built the temple and brought the sacrifices there. Thus, through the study of the text in Deuteronomy, along with the commentaries cited in the Haggadah, the Talmudic tractate of Bikkurim, and the further elucidations of the Rambam and others, we hope and pray that the merit of our Torah study will be the final act to tip the scales and bring Moshiach, the Messiah, and then the farmers of Israel will once again bring Bikkurim, declaring, I will exalt you, God, for you have raised me up. Isn't that great? All right, so now you have a picture in your mind of what the first fruits are and how they were brought in Jerusalem. Let us continue with tonight's daf as we go into a new Mishna, the second Mishna here in chapter 4. Apropos of different local customs discussed in the first Mishnah in this chapter, the second Mishnah discusses various halachas, various laws, with regard to which there are different customs. In a place where people were accustomed to sell small livestock to Gentiles, one may sell them. And in a place where the people were not accustomed to sell them due to certain concerns and decrees, one may not sell them. However, in every place, one may sell to Gentiles neither large livestock like cows and camels, nor calves or foals of these large animals, whether these animals are whole or damaged. The sages prohibited those sales due to the concern lest the transaction be voided for one reason or another, creating retroactively a situation where a Jew's animal, it was sold, but then the sale was rescinded and it came back to his possession. And while it belonged to the non-Jew, who, why wouldn't he, use the animal to work on Shabbos? The non-Jew is not prohibited to work on Shabbos nor to work his animals on Shabbos. So there's every reason to believe he would work his animal on Shabbos. But now that the Jew's animal came back to him, even though it was purchased, but while it was, in this state where it was purchased and then somehow it ended up coming back to him and then it was worked on Shabbos, so this would be a problem. And to prevent that from happening, the sages decreed that those large animals wouldn't be sold to non-Jews. However, there were ways around that restriction. That was for everybody. With respect to the small animals, the concern wasn't about working on Shabbos because they're not work animals. But the concern was that the non-Jews, idolaters at that time, would sacrifice these small animals to their idols. And so, lest you enable idolaters to worship their idols, it's like placing a stumbling block before the blind. Some communities had the custom to not even sell small animals to the non-Jews. But that was only a custom in some communities, not in others. That's what we're talking about now, about customs. Rabbi Yehuda permits the sale of a damaged animal because it is incapable of performing labor, meaning with the large animals. And Ben Beteira permits the sale of a horse for riding because riding a horse on Shabbos, although it's prohibited by rabbinic decree, is not prohibited by Torah law. It doesn't say you shall not ride your horse. It says you shall not work your animal. And riding is not the same as working it. The Mishnah cites another custom related to Passover. In a place where people were accustomed to eat roasted meat on Passover evenings, outside of Jerusalem or after the temple was destroyed, one may eat it. But in a place where people were accustomed not to eat such roasted meat outside Jerusalem, one may not eat it. Right? So the issue was that once the temple was destroyed, we could no longer bring the Paschal offering, whether a lamb or a kid from the goats, up to slaughter it in the temple courtyard, and then in our registered groups, eat the roasted lamb or the roasted goat that night. Right? It had to be roasted whole, none of its bones broken, nothing removed from it. It had to be eaten that night. Anything that was left over the next day had to be burned. But once the temple was destroyed, so now it would be a problem, and that's why we don't roast a lamb or roast a goat anymore, even though that was the practice before, because, you might think, well, you can roast meat. Okay, of course you can roast meat, but to roast the whole animal in the manner that it was roasted when the temple stood, it might seem like you're consecrating the animal. And we cannot consecrate animals anymore now that the temple is not standing and offerings cannot be brought on the altar. Now we get into the Gemara. So Rav Yehuda said that it is prohibited for a person to say in modern times, this meat is for Passover, due to the fact that one appears to be consecrating his animal as his paschal lamb, and he thereby eats consecrated items outside the permitted area. Rav Papa said this prohibition against saying this is for Passover applies specifically to meat, which is similar to consecrated meat. However, with regard to wheat, no, it does not apply. In that case, if somebody says this wheat is for Passover, he means, as we've discussed when we talk about shmura matzah, that he's going to watch it to make sure it doesn't ever come into contact with moisture and that it could become leavened, not that it's consecrated as an offering for the altar where also unleavened bread was brought. But this idea that with no temple, we don't consecrate meat, right? We don't consecrate meat. The Gemara asks, and with regard to meat, is that not the case? Is it true that meat could not be roasted because, that we could not set it aside for eating on Passover and roasting it because it might seem like consecrating, which we can no longer do when the temple is standing? Is that really prohibited? The Gemara raises an objection. Rabbi Yosei said, Theodosius, okay, which is it's a Greek name, or I guess it's a Roman. Is it a Greek name? It's actually a Greek name. I'm sorry, it's the Roman name. The Roman name, Theodosius, is the abridged version of Theodorus. Okay, so there was a Theodosius, and they called him Todos of Rome. And he was the leader of the Jewish community in Rome. So far we've been talking about, so there was a Jew, even in Talmudic times when Israel, was not the kingdom of Israel anymore. It was just, it was governed by a governor, a Roman governor. It was a territory of Rome. It was ruled by Rome. So there was a Jewish community, a quite oppressed Jewish community in Israel under the Roman rule. There was another Jewish community in Babel in Babylonia, which was under Persian rule. And there were other Jewish communities also. We just haven't been talking so much about them. One such community was actually in Rome, right? So there were Jews in Rome. There was commerce being done all over the Roman Empire, and there ended up being a Jewish community, even an observant Jewish community that was living in Rome at the time of ancient Rome and the emperors, etc. And so there was the leader of this Jewish community in Rome itself was this man Todos, okay, Todos. So he, Todos, instituted the custom for the Roman Jews to eat a kid of the goats, right, a young goat, roasted whole, with their entrails over their heads on the evenings of Passover evenings, right? Because it's outside of Israel, so 2 seders, because it's a festival the first 2 days, on the first and second night of Passover, as was the custom in the temple, to roast it whole and with its entrails about its head. The sages sent a message to him. They said to him, if you were not Theodosius, right? Todos, or Theodosius. If you were not Theodosius, whom we've heard of, an important person, I would have decreed ostracism upon you, as it appears as if you are feeding Israel, the people of Israel, consecrated food, which may be eaten only in and around the temple itself, right? It appears, obviously you can't be consecrated food, the temple's not standing anymore, but you're conducting yourself as if you were eating consecrated food because you're doing something that was only done in Jerusalem near the temple and is no longer done, say the sages. So it appears as if you are feeding Israel consecrated food, that appearance of impropriety. Then the Gemara asks about the terminology used here. Could it enter your mind that the meat was actually consecrated meat? No, that was certainly not the case. Rather say instead, doing so is like feeding Jews consecrated meat outside the permitted area. I jumped the gun a little and said it was like. The text originally says it's like you are feeding the Jews consecrated meat. Obviously, he's not feeding them consecrated meat, so it's like he's feeding them in consecrated meat. It looks that way. As due to its resemblance to the Paschal lamb, it could be misleading. So the Gemara analyzes this statement. A goat roasted whole, yes, it is prohibited. But a goat not roasted whole, no, it is not prohibited. Now this would contradict Rav, who prohibited roasting even ordinary meat. So the sages say that this is the distinction. With regard to a goat roasted whole, there's no difference if one said it is for Passover, and there's no difference if one did not say it is for Passover. In either case, it looks like a sacrifice, and it's prohibited. So you cannot roast a whole goat on Passover, right? With regard to a goat not roasted whole, if one specified that it is for Passover, yes, it is prohibited because it appears that he is consecrating it as a sacrifice. However, if one did not specify that it is for Passover, no, it is not prohibited as there is no concern. Now, a dilemma was raised before the sages with regard to this incident. Was Theodosius of Rome a great man in terms of his Torah scholarship? And the sages refrained from ostracizing him in deference to the Torah that he studied, as we saw yesterday. If somebody's going to be punished with something and he's a Torah scholar, rather than excommunicate or ostracize him, maybe they'll just have him flogged, which is actually considered the lesser punishment. But, he has put in a lot of time as a Torah scholar, and if they can discipline him with lashes rather than excommunicate him, they would prefer to do that. So now we're hearing about this Theodosius of Rome. So is he actually a Torah scholar, and that's why they refrain from ostracizing him? Or was he a violent man who could not be punished due to his local influence? In this case, not so much that he's violent. I mean, there's actually sending a letter from one community far away to Rome, but he's in Rome, and he's the leader of the Jewish community in Rome. Is it that he's so influential that he could cause problems to the Jewish community in Israel if they alienate him in Rome, and that's why they're being deferential? Or is he actually a Torah scholar and they're being deferential because of his Torah scholarship? Come in here, Tashema, right? That very often an answer to a question is introduced with these words, Tashema, come in here. So this was also taught by Theodosius of Rome. In other words, now the Gemara, the Talmud, is going to cite a Torah teaching of this Theodosius, meaning he was a Torah scholar. What does he teach? What did Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah see that led them to deliver themselves to the fiery furnace for the sanctification of the name of God during the rule of Nebuchadnezzar, rather than worship idols under duress? Who are Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah? Their names sound familiar. They should, from the book of Daniel. right? From the book of Daniel. This was that Jewish community that was in the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. And Nebuchadnezzar destroyed the first temple and exiled. He caused the exile, or at the first exile, the Babylonian exile. And then he took 4 young men, and they were Daniel and these 3, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And he sort of educated them in the ways of their court. They were, young men from a very good family. And Daniel ended up being at the very highest levels of Babylon. And then when the Persian Empire came and defeated Nebuchadnezzar, he also was high up in the Persian Empire. And there were several incidents where the king had a dream that no one could interpret. Daniel was shown in a vision not only what the interpretation was, but the king wanted his interpreters to tell him what his dream was. He wouldn't even tell them what the dream was. He wanted a correct interpretation without telling his dream interpreters what the dream was. No one could pass that test. Daniel could. So eventually there was this incident where the king... It's a whole complicated story. But the bottom line was that the king wanted, or his followers wanted, that the Jews would bow down to an idol, right? And they were not going to do it. Now, there's some argument about whether they could have, got out of, either bowing or martyring themselves, right? So maybe there was a third way where they didn't have to neither bow to the idol nor sacrifice their lives. But according to this teaching that we're going to hear from Theodosius of Rome, they were confident, right? In fact, they were saved. They walked into the oven and came out of the oven. They came out alive. And in fact, the courtiers of the king, who were so anxious to have the Jews killed, and actually threw these 3 guys into the oven was so hot that they ended up being killed. The ones who threw the Jews in, but the Jews entered in, unscathed and emerged unscathed. Why were they so confident that they were not going to be killed? Says Theodosius of Rome, they drew a kal v'chomer inference. They made a kal v'chomer. What's a kal v'chomer? This is one of the principles that the sages use to learn out laws that are not stated explicitly in the Torah. From where did they learn? From the frogs, the plague of the frogs, right? Of the 10 plagues in the Passover story, they learned from the frogs. With regard to the frogs, which are not commanded to sanctify the name of God by not bowing down to idols. I mean, they're frogs. Obviously, they're not commanded not to commit idolatry. But about the frogs, it is written in Exodus 7:28, and the river shall swarm with frogs, which shall go up and come into your house, and into your bedchamber, and onto your bed, and into the houses of your servants, and upon your people, and into their ovens and kneading bowls. All those places are listed in the Torah as where the frogs came into. Now, when are kneading bowls found near the oven? When are we kneading dough in a bowl near an oven? When we're going to bake bread. If we're kneading the dough, we have to have the oven hot already. When are the kneading bowls found near the oven? You must say that it is when the oven is hot. If, in fulfilling the command to harass the Egyptians, the frogs entered burning ovens, all the more so we, who are commanded concerning the sanctification of the name of God, that we would not bow down to idols because we are known to be Jews who will only bow to God, then should also deliver, all the more should we deliver ourselves to be killed in the fiery furnace for that purpose. Apparently, Theodosius taught Torah in public, which indicates that he was a great man. And I'll just mention that when it states in the Torah that the frogs died, those which jumped into the ovens are omitted, right? So there's this whole list of where they appeared, and then I guess it's listed again when they died, but the ones that jumped into the ovens are omitted, and so we surmise that they survived, And that's what those three companions of Daniel must have surmised. And so they went into the oven, and indeed they were correct, and they were preserved, and they came out alive. And then we'll just finish with one more sugya, just one more little paragraph, and then I'm coming to your questions. And it says that Rabbi Yosei bar Avin said, Theodosius was the one who cast profits from merchandise into the purse of Torah scholars. So not only did he teach Torah himself and taught effectively, and we just learned one of his teachings about why Daniel's companions learned from the frogs in the plagues that it was permitted and not commanded that they would rather go into the oven than bow down to an idol. And maybe even if they had a choice, it was better for them to martyr themselves in that situation. That's very unique circumstances, not something to be learned from. We avoid, right? The laws of the Torah are to live by, not to die by. It's only when there's absolutely no choice, bow down to the idol or be killed, that you have that choice to be killed. Some would say it's commanded, some say it's permitted. It's different. But we're not really studying that tonight. Another teaching about Theodosius of Rome, Rabbi Yosei bar Avin said, Theodosius was one who cast the profits from merchandise into the purse of Torah scholars. In other words, he would lend them money and enter into partnership with them so that they could open businesses. And that is praiseworthy, as Rabbi Yochanan said. Anyone who casts merchandise into the purse of Torah scholars is rewarded and sits in the heavenly academy, as it is stated, for in the shadow of wisdom is the shadow of money, Ecclesiastes 7:12, meaning one who provides Torah scholars with money so that they can continue studying Torah will merit being with them in the shadow of wisdom. And we also have a note. So why doesn't it just say that Theodosius gave money to Torah scholars? Why does it say that he cast merchandise into their purse? In other words, it's a better way of giving rather than just giving money, that you enable the poor, rather than give them fish, you give them a fishing pole, right? You open a business for them so that they're going to be self-sufficient, and yet in the kind of business where they'll have enough hours in the day to study Torah. And that would be the highest form of giving. All right, that's what we've got this evening. Let's look at comments and questions. 1 second, please. I did not open the tab, but I will have it in just 2 seconds, I hope. Here we go. Okay. Michael Diamond says, why do you say page 53? More like section 53. Unless your book is that much larger than my daf size from Art Scroll. And he also mentions that a kav is 1.2 liters, so a quarter kav that we mentioned before, like something like this, something like that. When the poor can't find that many olives out in the field, that's when it's time to remove the olives from our storehouse. Sharon Fran Brooks, a teacher of mine who is expert in the Haggadah, taught that this Torah section was used in the Haggadah because it was the most concise retelling of the history of Exodus. Shemot, the whole book of Exodus, was too long. Very good. Neil says, a beautiful lesson tonight. We do a Tu B'Shvat Seder. That's coming up soon, right? Rosh Chodesh Shvat. We're in it now. So the 15th of this month is Tu B'Shvat. And we have a teaching that there were no days as beautiful in the ancient land as Tu B'Shvat. And this was kind of like the Valentine's Day of ancient Israel, when the maidens would go out dressed in white, and the rich would lend white garments to the poor. So all the women were dressed the same, and you weren't looking for a woman based on how rich her family is, but rather what are her inner, spiritual Torah qualities. A very different kind of shidduch, a very different kind of matchmaking than exists today, even in the most traditional Jewish world, and certainly in the less traditional Jewish world. So anyway, there's a Tu B'Shvat Seder. A Tu B'Shvat is the birthday of the trees. Why were the maidens going out and having matchmaking? We could talk about that when we get to Tu B'Shvat. We'll release an article on our page. But really, Tu B'Shvat is the birthday of the trees. And so we celebrate like what grows on the trees. And a Tu B'Shvat Seder is usually celebrated with a plate with all these different kinds of fruit. It's early in the year, so it's dried fruit. Very often you see dried pomegranate, dried apricot, dried fig, raisins, of course, etc. Neil says, I see similarities to the bikkurim ceremony as it brings the 7 species. The Passover Seder plate doesn't have the 7 species, but it has the text. Sharon says, wasn't a lamb also considered a god to the Egypt? Oh my gosh. Thank you, Nina. I was thinking of Tu B'Av. I am completely off. Okay, Tu B'Av is the Valentine's Day, and that's in the summer. Scratch everything I said about that. But Tu B'Shvat is the birthday of the trees, and we do have the Tu B'Shvat Seder with all the dried fruits. Thank you. And thank you, Sharon, for pointing that out. But Sharon also says, wasn't a lamb also considered a god to the Egyptians? That was part of the challenge of the first Paschal sacrifice. Tying the lamb for 3 days before the sacrifice and the use of their blood on the door was a direct affront to the Egyptians, which worshipped this animal as a god. And might that be why they couldn't sell a small animal to a non-Jew, the risk of animal worship? Exactly. That's what it said, right? So that in these communities that wouldn't sell the small animals, it was this concern that the non-Jews in those days, the idolaters, would sacrifice those animals to their god, and you wouldn't want to put that stumbling block before the blind. Okay, pardon me for confusing Tu B'Shvat with Tu B'Av. Even as I was saying it, I thought something's wrong, but I'll just barrel forward. I should know better than to teach something I haven't prepared. But thank you, my friends, for being there for me and holding me up when I make a mistake. I really thank you and welcome anytime I make a mistake, please correct me. But at any rate, we've learned quite a bit tonight about bringing the first fruits up to Jerusalem. What a colorful ceremony that was. And let's keep that in mind when a Tu B'Shvat comes along, the Tu B'Shvat Seder, and at Passover this year, when we read the Haggadah and that passage, and that my father was a wandering Aramean, and the Syrians sought to destroy him, etc. And we see where that text comes from the recital of the bikkurim. Okay, my friends, have a great night, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow to learn on Thursday evening. All the best.